Good morning. It's 9:04 a.m. December 6th, 2012. Today's Kathy's birthday. Very good day. Today's discussion is about the real nature of complexity. Why things like Occam's razor really don't aid us that much. And where we're headed to, or from where we are at the moment. The idea of complexity for me comes from the 22 trillion times a second pulse that creates all of reality around us. It jumps to the middle of all the galaxies, then from there to the middle of all the solar systems, and then from each sun to every object in that solar system. It also gets all of those objects, including dust, that kind of thing, in between all of the solar systems and galaxies, etc. The pulse creates everything, 22 trillion times a second. If we think about it, space is really big. But it didn't start off that way. You'll note that the academics of the planet that are enthralled with Western, going all the way back to Greek understanding, which has been sort of perverted, proffer the idea that space exists independent of the stuff in it. And so their idea is that there was a big bang and in an infinite empty space, and the universe created itself in that infinite empty space. This could not be more wrong. In fact, what happened in the origin of the universe and the creation of it all, of the materium, was that the pulse, 22 trillion times a second, in the very first, this is really cool actually, the very first instance of the pulse creating matter, in my little bloop theory as opposed to the Big Bang theory, is that the pulse came into being, crossed all of space instantly, and turned around and came back and crossed over itself and banged into itself at a very slightly oblique angle, 22 trillion times within that first second. So the pulse traveled through all of space 22 trillion times in that first second of the materium. Now, that meant that it crossed itself 22 trillion times. And so the density of itself, that nexus, the area in which the intersection of all of the crossings within that space, that formed the first core, if you will, of the first atom. Now, it's my understanding, my thinking, that it took between 3 and 6.5 seconds for the first atom to create itself. And that's how I think universe materium started, was one atom at a time. And each atom comes along, each atom brings its own space. There was no space before the first atom. When the first atom created itself from the pulse, it's understandable that the pulse could cross all of space at that time 22 trillion times in a second, simply because space was very small. It was hardly any bigger than that atom that was going to pop into existence with it. And therefore, the pulse could jump across it really fast. Now, it gets tricky as we go along because each gets a little bit more complicated. So let's just say it took 6.5 seconds. So 6.5 seconds, we had 120 plus trillion intersections to form a very dense nexus, and that very dense nexus decided it had to do something that couldn't allow any more crossings to occur. And so what it did do was to create matter. And that matter plopped into existence with a bloop, and probably didn't make any noise. And because there was no waves or anything to make noise and nothing to hear it. But nonetheless, it's kind of cool to have a noise to go along with it. So the little bloop occurred, and there was the first atom. It was probably a hydrogen ion, actually. There are reasons for that we needn't go into. So 6.5 seconds later, we got the first instance of matter occurring. And from then on, it's been continuous, okay? And it's been continuously popping in every 22 trillionth of a second. The reason you can ascertain that is because after the first 6.5 seconds, more or less, between 3 and 6.5 seconds, and the first creation of the first atom, every crossing thereafter reaches a certain level of multiplicity, because, bear in mind, the density on the entirely energy side of materium of that first atom still exists. Even though that atom may have terminated its life and in terms of what it was supposed to do in materium, it no longer exists. Atoms in the materium are not persistent. They're template, if you will, within the energy world is persistent because of the nature of the pulse itself and the pause. And so it gets real complicated from there, which is one of the reasons I think Occam's razor is bullshit, is because Occam's razor postulates that simple is the general trend of universe, that which can be observed to be the more simple rather than more complex is more likely the solution. And I would dispute that. It's simply projecting a mental attitude on universe that universe has never demonstrated exists. That mental attitude being that simplicity somehow equals truth. And in fact, we find that the opposite is usually the case, that the truth is usually so complex it's very difficult for us to wrap our brains around it. And so, in fact, if you look at the nature of Occam's razor and a lot of these other postulates, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is a good example as well. These are actually expressions that are projections of a mental attitude onto universe. There's no demonstrable evidence from universe providing us a sound reason for thinking that Occam's razor is in fact accurate. So I'm a big fan of understanding that universe is actually moving the other way. It becomes more and more complex over time. I've seen this demonstrated in my lifetime, and everybody usually will see it demonstrated in their lifetimes, just given the nature of the progression of events over time and the escalation of complexity as more and more nexuses are created in the energy world, creating more matter, which causes the potential for more interactions to occur. And it is that potential, if you will, that is the gray area in which life is lived, in which the indeterminate exists. Now, that gets into a whole other subject itself, the value and purpose of the indeterminate or uncertain within chaos. Because you note that chaos could not exist without the very nature of uncertainty. But to a certain extent, uncertainty. The nature of uncertainty itself, however, involves the participation of our minds on the events as they unfold. Events in and of themselves are not uncertain if there's no mind to interpret it, very much like sound. The whole tree falling in the forest creates waves in the air, but I would say that if there's no being there to hear and react to it, there's no sound created. Just as the nature of complexity itself, it requires a certain level of interpretation within the minds that are perceiving it for such things as chaos to exist. Therefore, chaos in and of itself is not an abstraction that exists without beings, just as order doesn't exist without beings to perceive order. Matter merely is, in either cases, without the beings. This is very crucial, because it gets down to mind control, the way people manipulate other beings, the way that we're all manipulated in a mass level and a micro level, microcosm even. If you frame the perspective, then you can frame the thoughts that being is likely to have about the reality that they're encountering. This is especially true with us dumb bastards running around with our five senses and thinking that, that's really a solid apple you're biting into, and that those atoms are somehow merged with the atoms of your cells. This can be demonstrated as being absolute total bullshit just by the very nature of our perception of reality and the conundrum that this has presented to us. If atoms were solid, as material world aficionados and believers would have you understand, such things as coffee stains could not exist. Because how could one substance penetrate in and cause a change in the atoms of the other substance, absent the chemical reaction that we see with catalytic within the nature of a catalytic process reaction? So a stain could not penetrate and then therefore be not removable. And basically, if you think of things as solid, how is it that your skin could take ink? Wouldn't the ink of the tattoo grow out and fall off unless it's actually merged with the cells of your body and participating within your body from that point on? So the scientists of the material world who view the materium as being a discretely separate solid atom constructed with permanent atoms as the basis are quite wrong. This can be demonstrated easily with bazillions of thought experiments that defy the nature of that just with complexity that we see in ordinary life. So, ordinary life is very complex. The complexity is basically existent because we're interpreting it, but there's demonstrable evidence in the universe that complexity is the general trend as opposed to simplicity. So you can do away with all the things like Occam's razor or anybody telling you that in any way that simple is best. And the larger expression of being human would likely be to harmonize with complexity, learn to swim in it and enjoy it, and find ways to live successfully within it, as opposed to attempting to fight it and find something that does not exist, which is simplicity. Now, it's quite easy to find simplicity within the complexity simply because simplicity itself as is an expression of your brain, and you can decide, okay, I'm going to be simple today and concentrate on this to the exclusion of everything else, and leave out those areas of complicatedness that make my life or make me appreciate the complexity. This is really, to a certain extent, one of the points of meditation in terms of a side benefit of its use within the materium, is that the consciousnesses that use meditation within the materium arrive at the ability to exclude at a conscious level, little c conscious level, the intrusion of the rising complexity of universe around them. And this becomes very important, and we actually call this grounding or centering. Now, centering makes a lot more sense, but if we just examine grounding as an emotional layer upon the experience placed on it by our linguistic part of our brain, then what's that telling us? Well, it's telling us that we think of the meditation or grounding experience as being just that, the ability to act as a ground in an electrical sense and allow those things to flow through us and leave us basically untouched, the way that electricity flows through the copper and, in a sense, leaves it untouched. So, again, very important to pay attention to the language as we go along on this, because it reveals a whole lot about how we think about these things. And if we understand how we think about them, then basically being self-monitoring allows us to know who's coming around to fuck with us. And if we're being screwed with, because then you note your own thought process, and you can say, okay, hey, something's wrong here, stop and analyze it. You don't have to participate with it. You don't have to be at its mercy, because you're in control of your own mind. And you know what, there's an old Zen saying that in yoga, and I'm sure it's all over the place, that the mind is a great tool and a terrible master. And rather, you should understand that will should be the master. And will is very difficult to describe. You can feel it, though. You know you've got willpower the very minute you exercise it, and you have it as long as you exercise it. It's very easy to achieve. You can build it up. Unlike your muscles, it shows real growth right away. Every time you exercise it, you get that much better at it, and pretty soon you understand that willpower is a different thing from your mind, and it can control the mind. It makes the life a little bit easier, I think, because there's a lot of complexity and stress on the planet and in life, which brings us up to the whole point of this. There's a lot of information I need to put out about the chakras, about how energy actually transfers from the creation of each atom. There's also another process in which there's a continual stream of energy coming in that supports life within the denser form of the materium world. The chakras are indeed the transport system for that energy of life at various different levels. The Muladhara at the bottom, which forms you might think our baser, grosser energy, is literally the energy that allows you to move around. But as you go further up into the chakra systems, you get higher and more subtle forms of energy, and you become a more and more complex being as those energies intrude into the very nature of your body, because they're part of your body. That's going to be the subject for a whole long discussion, because there's all kinds of detail involved in that that's very meaningful to understand. At the moment, though, what I wanted to get into excuse me, was the nature of complexity and how it's manifesting in the chaos presumed, exported, labeled chaos that's expressing itself all around us, as well as what I see happening with the factions and